April 15, 1945. Ruins of a small town near the Rhine River, western Germany. In the smoke-choked streets of a shattered German town, young women like Anna huddled in cellars, whispering tales of the enemy marching in. They had been taught to expect monsters, gangsters in uniforms who would take everything, starting with their lives and dignity. But as the first American jeeps rumbled closer, what unfolded next would challenge every fear they held. What they found in those soldiers' hands wasn't weapons, but something far more disarming. Anna's hands trembled as she rationed the last crumbs for her family. The bread was stale, more dust than flour, and it barely filled the bellies of her mother and younger sister in their cramped basement shelter. By spring of 1945, life in Germany had become a daily battle against hunger, with civilians scraping by on about 1,000 calories a day, half what a person needed just to stay on their feet. Factories lay in rubble, farms were stripped bare by the war machine, and even the once proud cities along the Rhine were ghosts of their former selves, bombed night after night by Allied planes that seemed to blot out the stars. Anna, at 22, had served as one of the Helferinnen, young women who helped the Wehrmacht by operating telephone lines and radios, keeping the lines of command alive amid the chaos. She remembered the posters and the speeches that filled her days back in Berlin. America was a land of weaklings, softened by jazz and excess, its people too busy chasing money to fight a real war. Her trainers had drilled it into her. The Americans were decadent, their soldiers undisciplined thugs who would overrun Europe like locusts, looting, and worse. Pride in the Reich's purity had kept her going through the long shifts and the air raids, a shield against the growing doubts that whispered in the quiet moments. She clung to it now, as she divided the meager potatoes they had scavenged from a neighbor's ruined garden, ignoring the hollow ache in her own stomach. Yet beneath that pride, the hunger gnawed deeper, a constant reminder that the fatherland's promises were fraying at the edges. Anna's father had been lost on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier, his letters far away, their numbers swelling to nearly 300,000 men ready to push into the heart of the Reich. The air raid sirens had long fallen silent, replaced by the distant roar of engines that vibrated through the earth like a warning drum. In the dim light of their shelter, the women gathered closer, their faces pale shadows in the flickering candlelight. Anna tucked a faded photograph of her father into the hem of her skirt, the last piece of him she had left, and joined the hushed circle. The talk turned to rumors, carried from refugees fleeing ahead of the front lines. Stories that twisted the stomach like bad news. From the east, where the Red Army had already claimed vast stretches of land, came whispers of what awaited when soldiers broke through doors, shadows that stole more than homes, leaving women to pick up the pieces in silence, their eyes hollow and trust shattered. Over 2 million German women had been caught in the displacements of the war, families torn apart as armies surged forward, and now those tales felt all too close, a dark cloud rolling over the Rhine. Anna listened, her mind replaying the lessons from her time as a Helferinnen. The officers had warned them of the Bolshevik savagery, but the Americans? They were painted as no better, rich boys turned gangsters, their tanks fueled by greed rather than glory, ready to plunder the fatherland's ruins. She pictured them in her head, just as the posters showed, coarse faces, laughing as they took what wasn't theirs, their democracy, a thin mask for chaos. The propaganda had been her anchor through the bombings and the endless shifts, convincing her that the Reich's fight was pure, a stand against such moral decay. It tightened its hold now, steeling her against the fear that clawed at her chest, making her clench her fists around the photo until her knuckles whitened. But beneath the resolve, cracks formed. Her mother's voice trembled as she recounted a neighbor's letter, speaking of villages where the advancing forces left scars that no bandage could heal, women retreating into themselves like wounded animals. Anna glanced at her sister, just 16, wide-eyed and silent, and felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with dread. What if the stories were true for these Yankees, too? Snaked into view, engines growling low like a herd of mechanical beasts. She counted them at first, 10, 20, but they kept coming, a steady stream that stretched back toward the river, endless as the warnings from the radio broadcasts. The U.S. First Army had crossed the Rhine in force just days earlier, nearly 300,000 troops pouring over bridges and ferries, their advance so swift it outpaced the crumbling defenses of the Wehrmacht. To Anna, it looked like an invasion from some nightmare, not the ragtag force her leaders had mocked, but a machine of war that devoured the land without pause. The women in the shelter froze, their whispers dying as the vehicles halted at the town's edge. No artillery boomed, no orders barked in English shattered the air, just the creak of doors opening and boots hitting the ground. Soldiers fanned out, rifles slung but ready, their faces young and weary under steel helmets, scanning the ruins with eyes that seemed more curious than cruel. Anna's heart hammered against her ribs, every nerve screaming the lessons drilled into her during training. These were the barbarians from across the ocean, men softened by wealth but hardened by a hunger for Europe's soul, ready to strip away all that remained. She gripped the wall's edge, nails digging into stone, imagining the worst as the first group advanced down the main street, passing shattered storefronts and cratered sidewalks without a shot fired. In that standoff, time stretched thin, the air thick with the scent of diesel and damp earth. The locals emerged hesitantly from hiding spots, old men with raised hands, children clutching skirts, and the Americans held their positions, voices calling out in clipped commands that sounded almost polite, like shopkeepers haggling over prices. Anna watched from her vantage, a knot of fear twisting in her gut. The propaganda had painted them as monsters, yet here they were, methodical and restrained, their numbers a testament to a power the Reich could no longer match. Doubt flickered in her mind for the first time, a small spark amid the terror. Were they truly the demons she had been taught to fear, or something else entirely? A soldier broke from the line, his stride steady as he approached the cluster of women near the shelter's entrance, his hand raised not in more of caution than conquest. Anna shrank back into the shadow of the wall, her pulse racing as the soldier extended a canteen toward the nearest woman, an older lady with a shawl clutched tight. Water sloshed inside, cool and clean, a rarity in their parched world where even the river ran murky with silt and debris. The woman hesitated, then took it with trembling hands, sipping as if testing for poison, while murmurs rippled through the crowd. Anna's turn came next. The soldier nodded to her, holding out a piece of hard candy wrapped in foil, its shine catching the light like a forbidden treasure. She recoiled, stepping back as if burned, her mind flashing to the warnings. These men were invaders who took first and asked never. Their aid, a trick to lower guards before the real harm began. As a Helferinnen, she had been one of them once, relaying orders in crisp efficiency, believing in the Reich's code that demanded unyielding resistance. Now, in this flipped world, the Geneva Conventions guided the Americans' every move, international rules that treated even enemy women like her as prisoners with rights to dignity, food, and medical care, enforced strictly to avoid the chaos of reprisals. Yet to Anna, it felt like a trap, her body rigid with the fear that any acceptance meant surrender not just of arms, but of self. In that frozen moment, confusion bloomed in her chest, a quiet erosion of the iron beliefs that had carried her through the war's grind. Why offer when they could seize? The soldier didn't press, just lowered his hand and moved on, leaving the candy on a nearby crate like an unspoken invitation. Around her, A few women accepted the gestures, a sip here, a nod there, and the street began to stir with an uneasy normalcy, radios crackling in the jeeps with updates from command. Anna watched it all, the doubt planting roots deeper than she cared to admit, wondering if the enemy she feared was the one she had been taught to be. Night fell soon after, blanketing the ruins in a chill that sharpened the ever-present hunger, drawing the group back to the shelter with empty hands and fuller questions. In the dim cellar light, a canteen appeared like a mirage, held out by the same soldier who had approached earlier, his face meals with cheese, crackers, canned meat, and yes, squares of chocolate that melted just enough to hint at sweetness. In a land where bread lines stretched for hours and potatoes were a luxury, this abundance hit like a slap, a quiet reminder of the industrial giant across the ocean that the Reich's leaders had dismissed as fragile. Anna's eyes fixed on the bar he offered her, wrapped in crinkly paper that caught the light, its surface unbroken and tempting. She had been raised to see such things as signs of decay, the enemy bloated on excess, their food laced with the poisons of a godless society that valued comfort over duty. Her time in the Helferinen Corps had reinforced it. Officers shared stories of American waste, how their pilots bailed out with parachutes stuffed with gum and cigarettes, luxuries that mocked the German soldiers' Spartan resolve. Now, with her stomach twisting in protest, she stared at the chocolate, the propaganda warring with the raw need that clawed inside her. Her mother took one first, breaking off a piece for the younger sister, and the girl's face lit up in a way Anna hadn't seen since before the bombings, a simple joy that cracked something in her own chest. Why share when you hold all the power? The taste, when Anna finally allowed herself a tiny bite, was rich and forbidden, dissolving on her tongue like a lie exposed, hinting at a world where plenty wasn't a sin, but a strength. That small act rippled through the shelter, easing the tight knot of fear just a fraction, as women who had clutched their last morsels now passed portions back and forth, the soldier nodding approval before stepping out into the night. Confusion swirled in Anna's mind. This wasn't the plunder she had braced for, but a gesture that made her question the purity she had clung to, the idea that her side's hardships proved their moral high ground. The chocolate's lingering warmth stayed with her, a symbol of the divide she could no longer ignore. More women emerged from nearby ruins as word spread, drawn by the promise of the gesture, their steps tentative but hopeful in the morning light. Not every hand reached to harm. Some extended bread wrapped in wax paper and warm from the soldiers' packs, as if the act of giving was as routine. And the defeated, their supply lines humming with trucks that brought food faster than the Wehrmachts ever could. Anna watched from the edge of the group, her sister now perched on a crate with a blanket draped over her shoulders, a medic checking her for signs of malnutrition with gentle probes and nods. The little girl accepted a spoonful of something sweet from a spoon, syrup perhaps, and smiled shyly, her cheeks flushing in a way that spoke of strength returning. To Anna, this efficiency was unnerving, a far cry from the chaotic retreats she had seen on the German side, where supplies vanished into officers' pockets or were bombed to ash. The propaganda had branded these men as gangsters, loose-living thugs who fought for sport and spoils, their democracy a playground for the lazy. Yet here they were, dividing loaves and checking pulses with the precision of clockmakers, no leers or grabs amid the vulnerability. A woman beside Anna, her arm in a sling from a recent fall, received stitches without a flinch from the provider, just steady hands and a murmured, "Hold still." And for the first time, the myth cracked open in Anna's mind, letting in a sliver of wonder. Was this the real face of the enemy? Not monsters, but machines of mercy. Their quiet order exposing the desperation her leaders had hidden behind speeches of eternal triumph. That ordered kindness lingered in the air like the steam from hot coffee shared around a fire, easing the shelter's chill, but stirring questions in Anna that she dared not voice yet. As evening approached, one of the soldiers lingered near the group, his question simple and direct, pulling her into a conversation she never expected. Anna's mind flashed to letters from the East, where mercy was a myth, their faded ink now blurring in her memory like the faces they described. As the aid station wound down for the evening, the women returned to their shelters in pairs, carrying small bundles of provisions that felt heavier than hope. Anna helped her mother settle their sister on a pallet of straw, the girls breathing steadier now after the medic's care. But the quiet hours brought back shadows Anna had tried to bury. Letters from cousins in the path of the Soviet advance had arrived months earlier, words sparse and coded, speaking of villages turned upside down, where women's burdens grew invisible in the occupied zones. The officers quick to punish lapses that could unravel the order they imposed, their code as rigid as the Geneva rules that protected even those like her. No such reckonings haunted the tales from the East. There, the storm of revenge had swept through without restraint, leaving lives upended in its wake. Anna felt a stir of relief amid the lingering fear, a shameful warmth that the Yankees' restraint brought, even as guilt twisted for the losses on her own side, the families starving while these men shared without strings. Her pride in the Reich's unyielding stand cracked further, exposing the hollowness. Had their fight been for purity, or just another way to blind them to the world's wider truths? The fear clung like damp fog, but the small acts of the day planted seeds of doubt, making her question not just the enemy, but the ground she had stood on all along. As night deepened, a soldier approached the shelter's edge, his voice low and curious, drawing Anna into a private conversation that bridged the gap between fear and fragile understanding. One soldier's shared cigarette sparked words, not war, its ember glowing like a tentative truce in the deepening twilight. The man who approached was the same medic from earlier, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by faint scars, perhaps from training mishaps or earlier battles Anna could only guess at. He paused at the shelter's threshold, respecting the boundary without crossing it, and offered a smoke from his pack. Lucky Strike, the label read, a brand from a world of factory whistles and corner stores that felt as distant as dreams. Anna hesitated, her fingers brushing the filter as she accepted, the paper smooth against skin roughened by months of makeshift repairs and cold nights. Inhaling the rich tobacco, smoother than the harsh German blends she knew, she found herself answering his broken question about the town. How many lived here before the bombs? Where the water came from? Her voice steadying with each pull. He spoke of his own home in Iowa, flat fields of corn stretching endless under big skies, where families gathered for Sundays with pies and laughter, far from the grind of war. As the conversation flowed, halting at first but gaining ground, Anna probed gently, her questions laced with the barbs of old Notch. These weren't the soulless gangsters of the posters, but men with roots and regrets, their drive born of duty rather than divine right. That exchange stirred a storm inside her, questions tumbling like rubble. Had the Reich's eternal fight been just, or a blind charge into shadows cast by leaders who hoarded truth? The cigarette burned down to ash, leaving her with a warmth that wasn't just from the tobacco, a fragile bridge over the chasm of sides drawn in blood. As dawn broke the next day, the aid became routine, woven into the fabric of survival with hands that no longer trembled quite so much. A bar of soap felt heavier than any weapon in her pack, its plain wrapper promising a cleanliness Anna had almost forgotten was possible. The morning brought more trucks rumbling into the town square, their canvas sides bulging with crates that the soldiers unloaded with efficient grace, stacking them under the aid station's awnings like gifts from a forgotten holiday. Anna joined the line forming there, her steps measured, drawn by the murmurs of what lay inside. Not just food now, but the quiet luxuries that turned survival into something almost human again. A quartermaster, clipboard in hand, passed out squares of soap wrapped in sturdy paper, followed by folded linens that smelled faintly of starch, and pouches of ground coffee that steamed when hot water met it in dented mugs. These weren't battlefield scraps. They came from the vast supply chains of the U.S. Army, which shipped over 100,000 tons of goods each week across the Atlantic and into Europe, a lifeline woven from assembly lines that never slept, turning raw materials into the threads of daily life for millions. In the Reich's final days, such plenty had become a fairy tale, rations doled out in crumbs while factories choked on rubble. But here it flowed steady, a river of abundance that mocked the austerity Anna had worn like a badge. She took the soap to a basin set up behind the hall, the water clear from their purifiers, and lathered it slowly, watching suds rise white and thick on her arms. The grime of weeks, dust from collapsed ceilings, sweat from hiding, the invisible weight of fear, sloughed away under her fingers. Long lost, stirring memories of her father's table before the war stole it all. That ritual lingered with her through the afternoon, the symbols etching deeper into her thoughts, peeling back the promises of glory that had crumbled like the walls around them. Alone in the shelter that evening, as twilight faded the last light from the Rhine, deeper doubts surfaced, pulling Anna toward a truth she could no longer outrun. In the quiet of a makeshift shelter, truth crashed like falling walls, leaving Anna face to face with the ruins not just of her town, but of the world she had believed in. The evening shadows stretched long across the cellar floor, the air still carrying the faint scent of soap and coffee from the day's distributions. Anna sat alone now, her family asleep in the corner, the weight of the past hours pressing down like the collapsed ceiling beams overhead. She pulled out the photograph she had hidden in her skirt that first morning, the one of her father in his uniform, smiling stiffly beside her mother at a long-ago harvest festival, edges frayed, but faces sharp in her memory. It had been her talisman through the Helferinnen days, a reminder of the purity and purpose the Reich promised, the unyielding bond that no enemy could break. But as she traced the lines of his face, the doubts that had simmered all week boiled over, fueled by the soldier's steady hands and shared portions that mocked every speech she had heard about American barbarism. The propaganda had built her reality brick by brick, the Yankees as decadent invaders, their abundance a sign of soul rot, their advance a tide of moral decay that the fatherland alone could stem. Yet in the space of days, it had all unraveled. The endless trucks of supplies, the medics' quiet care, the simple decency that treated her not as spoils but as human, echoing the Geneva Conventions that allowed thousands of German auxiliaries like her to reintegrate into civilian life with minimal reprisals. Their service noted, but not punished in the rush to rebuild. She thought back to the East, the letters-coded horrors that had haunted her nights, the way women's lives there hung by threads of silence and survival. A revenge unchecked that her side had sown and now reaped in whispers. Here, though, the Americans enforced their lines with courts and codes. Their misconduct true cost wasn't in the bombed streets or the Rhine's muddy flow, but in the minds shattered long before the first shot, hers included, now picking through the debris of beliefs that had blinded her to humanity's wider reach. They gave what we could not, she admitted silently to the photo, the words a quiet surrender, not to defeat, but to a truth that healed as it hurt. In that moment of raw clarity, the shelter felt less like a cage and more like a threshold. The photo slipped back into her pocket, not as a shield, but as a bridge to whatever came next. The psychological shift settled over her like a soft rain, gratitude winning the battle against guilt, revealing that the real front had always been inside, where fear gave way to fragile understanding amid the ruins. As the Rhine's waters carried away the last echoes of battle, Anna stepped into an uncertain peace, forever changed by hands that fed instead of destroyed. The real victory lay not in tanks or treaties, but in the simple act of sharing amid chaos, reminding us that humanity endures even in the darkest ruins. If these stories of unexpected kindness touch you, consider subscribing for more glimpses into history's human side.